After El Salvador's deal in progress with the IMF collapsed due to their announcement of adopting Bitcoin as this compulsory tender, they then announced a $1 billion Bitcoin bond that they were going to issue. Can you talk to us a little bit about the El Salvador Bitcoin bond that was announced?
Honestly, I'd rather not, but I will. So the whole thing was sort of absurd from start to finish. Well, what's the first thing you look at when a country is issuing a bond? It's like, what do they claim they're going to use the funds for? Usually it's just to finance the budget, to pay for schools and policemen and so on. This bond was different. They were going to use half of the money to buy Bitcoin, so $500 million to buy Bitcoin, which is an incredibly risky and irresponsible thing to do with taxpayer money. I mean, we already saw Three Arrows Capital just spectacularly blow up because it was trading with a lot of leverage. So it's no different for a sovereign country. You know, there's a reason why countries don't take out debt to buy Apple stock, because maybe it turns out that the Apple stock is Enron stock and you're going to lose a bunch of money. So what leverage does is it massively amplifies the upside and it massively amplifies the downside. So purchasing cryptocurrencies with leverage is just extremely ill-advised. The other thing that they were going to do with the money was build out renewable geothermal electric capacity / fund a new city called Bitcoin City. It's a city that doesn't exist yet, but they were going to create it. So $500 million was going to be destined to these things. It's unclear if it's remotely near enough money to build a whole city. And that's a polite way of saying it costs... No, obviously not. Yeah. I mean, it's funny and whatnot. But the important point is it was also absurd because, as I keep saying, El Salvador needs to undertake a fiscal adjustment. They cannot afford to be spending on half-baked, non-essential projects that are like number 67 on the priority list. They really have to allocate their scarce budgetary resources in the most efficient and impactful ways. And spending it on these projects is just not a way to do that at all.
From what I recall, they immediately said that the bond was oversubscribed, that everyone wanted in on this. Meanwhile, they're working with Bitfinex to do this bond. They're listing it on the Liquid network. All of this stuff, in terms of it being able to be purchased by a lot of people, was absurd and not true. So then COVID happens, they delay the bond, and then, even though the bond is oversubscribed, they delayed it again. So they've delayed it twice now, and from what I can tell, it's possible this bond just doesn't even ever happen.
I mean, there's just so much of it that is unusual, to put it in the most polite terms. So typically, when a bond is sold, you have a prospectus, an offering circular. There's these long legal documents that have all of these terms and conditions. What currency is the bond denominated in? What are the events of default? So like what triggers the default? What remedies are there? What are the clauses and the covenants? And so it's just like endless legal documentation for any one of these bonds. Well, the Volcano bond didn't have a prospectus. It also didn't have a white paper. It didn't have a website. It didn't have anything. That was just crazy. I mean, Bitfinex being the issuer, also crazy. Bitfinex is banned in the United States of America. And a large amount of the trading activity and the money and the people with the deepest pockets in crypto are all in the US. So how are you going to sell a $1 billion bond if the US market is just shut off?
Most people know Lightning. Lightning Network is kind of like this peer-to-peer, but you have to have an open channel and you have to fund your channel to pass money from one person to another. It's kind of stupid, but all the Bitcoin people really, really love Lightning. And Bennett also said it was cool. Never forget, Bennett. Bennett said Lightning Network was cool. Anyway,
I still stand by it.
Yeah, don't. Anyway,
not cool.
Liquid Network is even stupider in a sense, in that it was like a group of the most trusted cryptocurrency exchanges working together to allow people to essentially send money through this network of trusted exchanges. Trusted being Kraken, Bitfinex, like not the best people in the entire world. And yeah, obviously it's not widely used because anyone who's a cryptocurrency advocate is like, well, this is stupid. We're trusting the worst actors in the space. And anyone who isn't a crypto advocate is saying, well, this is stupid. We're trusting the worst actors in finance. So either way, they've kind of run both sides out of this thing. And of course, that's where they're going to offer this bond, right? Why not?
But there's more. All of El Salvador's bonds, the Euro bonds, the foreign bonds, they are New York law debt contracts. So they're issued in the city of New York. So if there is a debt default, you get to argue in front of a New York judge to restructure the obligation. These Volcano bonds were not going to be New York law debt instruments because to issue a debt in New York, you need a prospectus. And as I said earlier, they never had a prospectus. They never had any documentation whatsoever. So that led me to conclude that this was going to be a local law debt instrument. That means it was going to be governed by local El Salvador law, which means that if there are issues, if there's non-payment, if there's a default, etc., you have to go argue before a judge in El Salvador to sort it out, to try and recover your investment. Obviously, that's not a great prospect because judiciary independence in El Salvador has been weakened significantly in the last 2 years. A number of Supreme Court justices were replaced in May of 2021, if I remember correctly. So the court was packed. That really increases the risk profile of the instrument because if there is a default, then you can't sue in New York. You have to sue in San Salvador. And maybe they'll treat you well, but maybe they won't. It's just an added layer of risk. There's another thing with the Volcano bond that was also very unusual, which is that the Republic of El Salvador was going to issue the bonds. But then there was this fascinating piece of reporting from the Financial Times that said that the state-owned energy company Lajeo was going to be the issuer. A change of issuer is a big deal. So for me, this was like, what on earth is going on? So I started researching who is this company Lajeo. They sell 22% of the electricity in El Salvador, so not even like 80%. They're small within El Salvador. They have like a $750 million balance sheet, if I remember correctly. So they were going to more than double that with the issuance of the Volcano bond. They had like $250 million in long-term debt. They were going to like sextuple that with the issuance of the Volcano bond. They have $135 million in revenue last year. So the Volcano bond was $1 billion, 6.5% coupon, $65 million in annual interest expenses. So they were going to saddle that electric company with $65 million of interest expenses on $135 million in revenue. I mean, the whole thing is like totally nuts. So unsurprisingly, they walked that back a few weeks later. It's just like there were so many odd things with this issuance, the use of funds, the lack of documentation, the fact that it was going to be Bitfinex, the fact that it was going to be local law, having Lajeo, this like unknown state-owned enterprise, be the issuer.
That doesn't even touch on the idea that we already mentioned again of like, $500 million for a city. It costs like $30 million to build a single hotel, right? Like, what the fuck are you talking about? What the actual fuck are you talking about? There's no way this works at all. Even functionally, this thing is broken on every single level. The way it's structured now is insane.
It's highly unusual, and in my opinion, it's very unlikely that it will ever work in anything resembling this kind of format, which is why, essentially, it's dead. Every now and then, the finance minister says that it's alive and that they're working on it and so on, and people have asked me why. Why would the finance minister say that? He's a political appointee. He serves the president, and the official party line is that this thing is alive, so he'll keep saying that it's alive. It doesn't mean that it is, though.